I'm John Perrett. I'm the head of statistics. David, my esteemed colleague, he's going to be the second half of this double act in a moment. This is going to be the outlook for economy and insolvency, to the extent that we can tell you. I'm going to start by setting the scene, showing what's happened to corporate and personal insolvencies recently. This story is going to be very familiar to many of you, but I hope to pick out some interesting nuggets and also update you on the latest movements in case numbers that were published this morning. Beginning with corporate insolvencies, this is what's happened over the last 16 years. As you can see, the trend was fairly stable up until 2008-09 when the wheels fell off everywhere. The biggest difference at that time was seen for creditors' voluntary liquidations. Even during the recession, the compulsory winding up orders stayed fairly flat. Aside from an uptick in 2011-12, which was a pretty bad year for retail and restaurants, the trend's been pretty well downwards since 2009, but it still took until 2014 for case levels to get back to where they were pre-recession. CVLs themselves have been pretty stable for the last 2 years. It's compulsory cases and administrations that have driven most of the recent decrease. And the latest stats out this morning are pretty much in line with that trend. CVLs have stayed the same. A further decrease in the total, driven mainly by compulsory cases. When you think of the number of compulsory liquidations, what does it tell you other than it's a number? This sets it in the context of hundreds of things all not going into liquidation, and just that one out of 241 is the latest stat this morning. And that's the lowest rate since comparable records began in 1984. Part of that lowest since forever is because there's been a massive expansion in the number of companies, up from about 800,000 in the early 90s to over 3 million today. Looking at what sort of industries go into company insolvency, the top 5 of construction, retail, admin services, accommodation and food, and manufacturing, they've stayed the same top 5, although not always in that order, since at least 2012. Most of these industries have seen a fall in insolvencies, as there has been generally. Some of the ones near the top of the graph that haven't seen a fall are the accommodation and food sector and the professional, scientific and technical sector. These are all in today's stats. Turning to personal insolvency, these had been trending downwards since 2014, but have since started to increase. And that has been sustained in this morning's stats as well, which I'm afraid haven't made it onto today's slides. There's been 22,500 personal insolvencies in the latest quarter. And the latest increase has been driven by a more than 2/5 increase in the number of individual voluntary arrangements since this time last year. That's partly because they dipped down this time last year, so it's pretty much back to where they were at the end of 2014. DROs, debt relief orders, are also up since this time last year. This is mainly because of an increase to the eligibility criteria, and about a quarter of new debt relief orders are for qualifying debts more than the old limit of 15,000. Bankruptcies have continued to fall, but the rate of fall has slowed down recently. Putting it in the context of the population, again, this is a new stat out this morning. 1 in 541 adults became insolvent in the last 12 months, or just under 0.2% of the adult population. It's the first increase in the insolvency rate since 2 years ago. Looking at demographic breakdowns, for the last 2 calendar years, the insolvency rate for women has been higher than the insolvency rate for men. Men and women are equally likely to enter an IVA, but women have a much higher debt relief order rate, and that outweighs the higher male rate for bankruptcies. You're much less likely to enter insolvency if you're aged under 25 or 65 and over, and the peak in the rate is in the 35 to 44 age bracket. And looking at the map, which we published 2 weeks ago, there's hot spots in coastal areas generally, the northeast and the southwest, and some pockets in the Midlands. So next, I'll talk about the sorts of things that we observe as being correlated or associated with changes in insolvencies. Beginning with personal insolvency. This now is looking at year-on-year change in personal insolvencies. This is the total. Above the dark line is an increase since the previous year, and below the line, a decrease. And here we can see the rapid increase in personal insolvencies in the mid-2000s, peaking in 2006 when the year-on-year change was over 80%. There was then a decrease just as rapidly before another increase in 2009. Overlaying the change in household debt, there's a similar pattern, a period of rapid increase and peak, decrease, increase again, and then a fall. But the peaks and troughs don't come anywhere near lining up until we do this, which is where we shift the debt graph by 2 years. What we take from that is that the change in debt 2 years ago has a pretty strong association with the change in insolvencies now. Broadly speaking, if the year-on-year change in debt has been under 4%, then the change in insolvencies tends to be a decrease. If the change in debt is over 7%, then insolvencies tend to go up 2 years later. Broad brush, and it doesn't quite always work out like that, but on average. Looking at companies, a similar association with gross domestic product or change in GDP, but this time it's negative, as you'd expect. If the economy is tanking, then insolvencies go up. And this time the relationship is much more immediate. It's normally there, or it normally happens more or less simultaneously. Year-on-year change in GDP of about 2.5% and over is mostly associated with a decrease in insolvencies. And where there's a contraction, then there's an increase. That'll do from me for the moment. Over to David.
Thanks, John. Right, I'm going to take you through the next couple of slides on this, where we're going to be looking at some of the economic forecasts and risks that are facing the UK economy, because as John's spoken about, those kind of factors, how they're going to influence gross domestic products, personal debt levels. I like to see what could happen to insolvencies in the UK in the coming years. And then take you through the other problems that we solve with trying to forecast what's going to happen with the insolvency rate. There's a lot of changes that have been happening within the insolvency landscape, which means forecasting them in general is quite difficult. It's not exactly trying to hit an old target, it's a new one every time. So, starting off with the key ones. At the beginning of this year, the UK economy was looking at unfavourable outlook from some of the emerging markets, some of our key BRIC economies. The Brazilian economy was looking at quite small levels of growth. More recent times, that's responding a bit more from some stimulus action that's been taken by the Brazilian government. The oil price dropping quite significantly the last year or so has impacted Russia quite significantly. That's been hurting them in their way. With India and the Chinese economies also delivering a lot lower levels of growth than we've previously seen, especially with China having its reorientation from its largely export-led economy to a more consumer-orientated one. These are having ramifications for global demand around the world, with the UK in particular. The euro area crisis is never going away, or it doesn't feel like it's ever going away, and the most recent chapter we're seeing now is with the Italian banking sector. Previously seemed to be having a lot of difficulties, a lot of problems, and whether or not that leads to another outbreak of this contagion that we've seen in the area and how that can affect the UK economy going forward is being kept a very close eye on by the Treasury. These uncertainties regarding the emerging markets in the euro area have had quite a significant play on the equity markets in the UK in this last year, although the biggest single event that has impacted on the equity markets in the UK, of course, has been the outcome of the referendum. The FTSE 100 has recovered largely from the shock that it faced after the Leave vote that happened. That's more of an outwardly international-based index, so that was not a big surprise that it would recover not much sooner. FTSE 250, which is much more UK domestic based, is still below the levels that it was pre-referendum vote, but has recovered a lot of the space that it had at that time. Consumer confidence in the UK was largely at the lower levels that we've seen for quite some time in this year, and it took a particular hit when the referendum hit. Consumer confidence is crucial for gross domestic product in the UK. because it feeds into the large amount of consumer spending that happens in the United Kingdom. But largely what we really worry about more than anything else is the change in business investment. Business investment and changes in the economy are largely what then feeds in to consumer confidence and sentiment and largely into consumer spending. So that's what the key factor that's being watched at the moment is how are these kind of variables actually affecting business investment levels in the UK. Also, low productivity growth. This is a long-term ailment of the UK economy versus our international partners. We always have lower levels than we other parts have, and since the financial crisis it has been even lower than usual. And if that is a key priority for this government, is rectifying that productivity growth, and it will maintain so. The EU referendum vote has left a considerable amount of uncertainty in the economy at the moment, and how that's affecting things is still being found out. We have many indicators we've got at the moment. Some of them are very mixed, and we have some saying in either direction of what could be occurring. As I said, the equity markets, some of which are recovered, but other areas in consumer confidence took a particular hit. In terms of actually saying what the forecasts of impact are going to be, I've got quite a difficult job because pretty much all the economic forecasts that were done and have been done over the last 6 months, last year or so, have assumed a yes vote, a remain vote. So they're pretty much out the window now. And the government has committed to doing new ones for the autumn statement. And we've only really got as analysis of what could have been happening to GDP before, based on some of the scenarios some of the government was putting out. So what I'm going to show you today is I'm going to show you the scenarios we put out by Majesty's Treasury in advance of the referendum vote, and also some analysis has been done post-referendum vote by the International Monetary Fund on the impact of GDP of a Leave vote. All of them are saying there will be a negative impact, but largely it's to do with scale. So, pre-referendum analysis from HMT. The top line there in the OBR budget 2016, this was the budget scenario that was put together, and it was assuming a Remain vote was taken. The two scenarios put there, we have one which was a shock scenario, one was known as a severe shock scenario. How this was done is largely based on the idea that whatever the new environment would be for the UK economy. So they took an extreme view of saying it would either be one where we have highly open arrangements or very similar arrangements, or ones we don't have very much at all. Either way, we were looking at a potential recession hitting in the latter half of this year, beginning of next year, but most of the effects felt through at the end of about 18 months. But those were scenarios, and we're so uncertain, and the latest forecast we put out with the autumn statement, I can't reiterate it enough, that's one of those career limiting moves if I don't say those things enough. This latest analysis was only produced the other day by the International Monetary Fund, showed quite a significant impact on gross domestic product changes. Looking at the larger impact in 2017, the loss of about a percentage point of GDP, and in 2016, the loss of only about 0.3%. Not as large an impact in 2016, largely because the recent GDP seems we have a much stronger economy than we thought in the first half of this year, so the effects from the Leave vote shouldn't be having too much of impact immediately than we thought. So we've talked about some of the forecasts that can be going on. I can't give you anything else because there isn't a lot else out there. The key kind of forecasts we would need over our household debt, household servicing costs, forecasting for corporate debt, they simply aren't available yet and haven't been published, and we don't have them, so I can't show them to you. Unfortunately, I'd love to talk about them. But forecasting them generally is quite difficult. We've seen a number of changes to the insolvency environment in the last year, as you're no doubt aware. We've seen introductions of online debt solutions in April. We ourselves are looking at that to see if it's led to behavioural changes and differences in the types of people we're seeing entering bankruptcy. We're looking at them. We simply don't know yet, but we're analysing that information. John mentioned we've seen changes in the DRO thresholds, which led to different people entering debt relief orders. We saw shifts from people going from bankruptcy into debt relief orders because of that. This came in October 2015, the same as the changes in the bankruptcy creditor petition limit, the increase from £750 to £5,000, which led to, again, changes in the attitudes of people taking creditor petition action. We've also seen some quite significant changes in other enforcement action taken by creditors. There's been some large increases in the court fees for small claims, and we're getting some evidence from various stakeholders and things like that they may have changed some of their approach to enforcements and things like that based on those changes. Well, that could lead to some new insolvency trends going forward. Again, we're closely monitoring that. You also probably no doubt are aware of the significant review of debt management plans that have gone on over the last few years, led by the Financial Conduct Authority. We're reviewing those because some of the outcomes of those have been changes in debt management plans being converted into insolvency, individual voluntary arrangements, and bankruptcies. So we're keeping an eye on that to see whether that's a changing trend going on there. That's largely all we've got at the moment, unfortunately. I'd love to give you more, but we are where we are. John.
Right, so I shall close this one by saying that the title of this session, the outlook for the economy and insolvency, was a bit of a misnomer. The expected impact on insolvencies is, in a word, unknown. So that's the short version. The long version, if we were just looking at, say, changing household debt against personal insolvencies, then just based on those alone, we'd expect to be seeing further decreases in personal insolvencies. That's because for the last 2 years, changing household debt has been around about 2% a year, which is pretty low by standards of the last 15 years or so. The Bank of England, albeit pre-referendum, was forecasting that change in household debt wasn't going to get above 4% until the end of next year. And so that wouldn't affect case numbers until probably 2018, 2019. On the corporate side, the link with GDP is moderate at best. We've seen decreases in corporate insolvencies in times of pretty weak growth. We've seen increases in corporate insolvencies in times of boom. That's even leaving aside the things that David's just said about changes to the insolvency landscape. So the long version also is, we don't know. So thank you for listening. And I think we've got time for a few questions.